Good day, everybody. Welcome back to the Women's History Conclave. The Conclave, as you all know, was created in 2020 amidst pandemic and lockdown. We had created it partly to divert ourselves and give our lives some meaning amidst the pervasive despair and distress. But more importantly, to make available to ourselves a platform for engagements in women's history through online lectures and discussions on different aspects of women's history. We've also wanted to connect with scholars of women's history across the globe. The pandemic is nearly over, but this platform continues to be important to us all. It continues to be immensely important and relevant to us because with one click on the link, we can instantly connect with stalwarts such as Professor Shawna Banerjee and Professor Geraldine Forbes, Professor Shomita Sen, Professor Bornita Bagchi, and also our esteemed scholars based in Bangladesh. So, and this ability to connect with all those who are doing women's history in different parts of the globe. I mean, this is really wonderful. I mean, the pandemic has. This is one good thing that pandemic has given us. This online platform, the very idea of holding lectures and discussions on the online platform. This we've got from the pandemic, a very positive side of the pandemic, and we are trying to use this platform for our own benefit, for our own intellectual stimulation. Now, today, our esteemed speaker is Professor Swapna Banerjee. She will be speaking on In Defense of Fathers, Daughters Recall Memories of Fathers from Colonial Bengal. This is the title of her lecture. Now, our esteemed chairperson today is Professor Geraldine Forbes. Now, let me briefly introduce Professor Swapna Banerjee. Professor Banerjee is professor of South Asian History at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her research lies at the intersection of gender, class, race, and ethnicity in colonial South Asia. Professor Banerjee focuses on women, servants, children, fathers, masculinity, domesticity, and family life in colonial Bengal. Her recent monograph, Fathers in a Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India, will be published, will be in the market. I think it's already been published, but it's not yet available in the market. It has been published by Oxford University Press. Now, this book interrogates the strong connection between fatherhood and masculinity and blurs the boundaries between private and public spheres. Her previous monograph, Men, Women, and Domestics, Articulating Middle Class Identity in Colonial Bengal. This too was published by Oxford University Press. It was published in 2004. Now, this book employed the lens of employer-servant relationships to understand the construction of national identity in colonial Bengal. Currently, Professor Banerjee is engaged in an Australian Research Council-supported large collaborative project. The name of this project is Ayas and Ammas, Trans-Colonial Servants in Australia and Britain, 1780 to 1945. Banerjee currently holds a Distinguished Scholar Fellowship for the Advanced Research Collective at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. For 2016 to 18, she was the endowed chair in Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on British imperialism, Indian nationalism, gender, race, empire, gender, family, state, and women in modern India. Professor Banerjee is affiliated with PURAI, Global Indigenous and Diaspora Research Studies at the University of Newcastle, NSW, Australia. She serves on the editorial board of the Rutledge Studies in the Histories of Children and Youth and the Bloomsbury Press new series, The Other in Empire. She is a member of the board of directors of an UN-registered NGO, Women's Founders Collective. Professor Banerjee can be reached at banerjee@brooklyn.cuny.edu. Now I request my co-convener, Dr. Bhashwati Chatterjee, to introduce Professor Geraldine Forbes to the audience. Of course, both of them need no introduction, Professor Banerjee and Jerry. They need no introduction. They're already familiar names and very dear names. I mean, very beloved ones they are in the Bengali academia, Indian academia. But, well, we have to be formal. And so, Bhashwati, please introduce Jerry to the audience.
Thank you, Aparna. Yes, it's a great pleasure for Women's History Conclave to today invite Professor Shawna Banerjee and Professor Geraldine Forbes as the chairperson of this session. First, but let me take this opportunity to just say a few words, because today it's August 27th and we have passed the birth centenary of the revolutionary Veena Das, and Women's History Conclave commemorates these brave revolutionary. Her date of birth was 24th August 1911. So it's just a few days back we passed the her birth centenary. And one thing I don't know whether it's a coincidence or not. We are eagerly waiting to hear Swapna Di what she will be talking about. But just I want to mention one thing, that Veena Das also she wrote a book on her father. The name of the book is Pitridhan, the legacy I inherit from my father, something like that. So I haven't read that book also. So, but maybe something related or something not related. But the theme is the daughter is speaking about her father. So now let me do the formalities. So already as Aparna told that Professor Geraldine Forbes needs no introduction. Still, it's a formality and we have to do it. So Professor Geraldine Forbes is Distinguished Teaching Professor Emerita, Department of History, State University of New York, Oswego, USA, and Executive Director, Women's Founders Collective. She received her PhD in History from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana in 1972. She was the Fulbright Nehru Teaching Professor, Women's Studies Research Center, Calcutta University in 2011-12. She has won several awards and grants in course of her career. She was the member of the editorial boards of different reputed journals and academic committees. In 1979, she was awarded the Robindra Puroskar for the best book published in 1979 on Bengali culture, Positivism in Bengal. In 2006, she won the Sunny Research Foundation Research and Scholarship Award in recognition of exemplary contributions to research and scholarship. In 2012, the International Center of Syracuse, New York, declared her International Educator of the Year. Professor Forbes has a wide range of books and articles to her credit. The Forbes collection in the Oriental and India Office collection of the British Library, containing publications and papers relating to Indian women and women's studies, collected by Professor Geraldine and Professor Forbes, is available for use. Thank you so much. We invite both of you. We are extremely honored, ma'am. And now I ask Professor Shawna Banerjee, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bhashwati, thank you, Aparna, especially for such a generous and lengthy introduction. And also thanks to the Women's History Collective for all the great works they've been doing through the pandemic. I'm especially grateful to Geraldine Forbes, for chairing the panel. A lot of the materials used in this talk comes from her books, and the pictures also come from her collections. I want to say hello to everybody because I cannot see any of you when I'm sharing my screen. So please pardon me if I'm missing anybody or if I'm not trying to neglect anyone here. And I'm really grateful for coming out on a Saturday evening or morning to attend this talk. So there is an ecstasy and a fear in sharing my work with an informed audience. The examples or contexts are really familiar to most of the participants here, and I hope to gain insights from your feedback. Let me say a few words in the way of introduction and the background to this work. What I'm sharing today comes from my recent book called Fathers in a Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India. The whole project comes in the context of studying fatherhood that I considered in the broadest possible sense, mainly within the context of colonial Bengal, although it draws on examples from beyond Bengal. So let me start with the structure of the lecture. So I start out with an introduction, and then I share my overall argument, the historical and historiographic context, and then I engage with my sources, women's memoirs, as they recall their fathers. Thank you, Bhashwati, for pointing out Veena Dash's work. I have not considered her work for this talk or the book. And then I arrive at my analysis and conclusion. What the PowerPoint will do is basically, I'll show the pictures of the daughters and fathers that were that I could access. Honestly, it's not that every single character is being shown in images here. At the end, I will share my points on, my analysis and conclusion, but most of the lecture I'll talk. It's not on PowerPoint. So this is my broad argument. So let me begin with what I want to present before you. So set primarily in colonial Bengal, my work focuses predominantly on the educated Hindu community and the Brahmos, who were in the forefront of progressive social reforms concerning women, children, and family in 19th and 20th century India. I need to emphasize that the talk centers on the upper caste and the upper class males who were products of colonial education, the Shikhito Sampradaya, the educated Bengali middle class, who served the colonial administration in different levels. Undefined and unaddressed as a sociological category in historical scholarship, the fathers that I examine were members of the native intelligentsia with roots in the villages. The fathers, ranging in age from young to mature adults, represented the newly settled urban community, who often were the absentee landlords, and hence their lives straddled both the city and the village. These fathers were exposed to the ideas of the West, and as modern individuals were instrumental in translating concepts that traversed both the non-West and the West. Similar processes can be discerned among Muslim communities as well. My focus on the Hindus and the Brahmos is not to privilege one over the other or to exclude other groups, but it is mainly determined by the sources I examined. My broad argument. My close examination of father-daughter relationship demonstrates how masculinity or purushottva of Indian men was framed within the domestic and the familial domain. It is an attempt to show how manhood was constituted by Indian men, not within the distinctly marked public spheres where they engaged with the colonial government, but it was also constituted within the domain of the familial and the that allowed them the space to exert their power and authority. In short, I'm suggesting, or rather questioning, the boundaries between the public and the private, the inner and the outer, by steering our gaze from the public debates and controversies to the more personal worlds of family life. By positioning the reformers and leaders as fathers, I contend that fatherhood, just like newly conceived models of motherhood and mothercraft, assumed new significance in the changing society and culture of colonial India. I locate these fathers as modern subjects, as family men riddled with contradictions, whose masculinity was constituted by the authoritative and effective relationships with their children, rather than only via heteronormative relationships based on muscular strength and as breadwinners. By emphasizing the connection between masculinity and fatherhood, I argue that the study of masculinity in late colonial India remains incomplete without an examination of fathers and fatherhood. So for this paper, I delve into the personal narratives of Bengali women that dwell on memories of their fathers. By closely attending to women's narratives, my paper attempts to understand the different ways the authority and power of the father was invoked and constituted in everyday experiences. Through women's own words, the paper explores the many ways girls and women of specific caste, class, religion, and ethnic status were defined and subjugated through patriarchal norms and authority. Most of these women, as adults, came to the defense of their fathers. By deliberating on these writings, my objective is to problematize modern Indian patriarchy that subjected women to a new cultural domination in the course of the 19th century. Fatherhood, as a cornerstone of patriarchy, worked through assumption, appropriation, enunciation, and performance of personal and paternal responsibilities. But women too had a role in the constitution of this patriarchy. Their conformity and complicity with prescribed norms also went into the making of the modern fathers. So from here, let me give you some historical context and as well as my engagement with the current historiography. As we know, in 19th century India, educated Indian men, especially the Bengalis, the fathers I'm talking about, were often subjects of derogatory criticism by the colonial government. The British designated the middle-class Bengali Hindus, the most typical representative of this group, as effeminate babus. In the words of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who was instrumental for introducing English as the official language in India in 1835, the Bengalis were, and I quote, feeble even to effeminacy and were weak even to helplessness. The Bengali men were routinely identified with the frailty of women, and again I quote, and the powerlessness of the submissive slave. The response this critique generated among the educated Hindu middle-class men was multifaceted. The internalization of the critique spurred on responses and reactions that were often contradictory and limited. To counter those criticisms, as an autocritical exercise, the Shikkhita Sampradaya, or the educated community, the Bhadralok fathers, assumed a stance that denounced the dissolute lifestyle of the new comprador class who were also fostered by the colonial economy and gained social power and wealth in the new urban environment. At the same time, these middle-class fathers also distanced themselves from the poor and the uneducated, namely the coolies, who abandoned their children and were unable to provide them with education or economic sustenance. The social distances and distinctions from different segments of the society that the Bhadralok fathers claimed was complicated by notions of respectability and masculinity ushered in by a host of indigenous and foreign elements. At this conjuncture, when their role was challenged and shaped in many ways, the educated men were among the first to question traditional social customs and envision new models of womanhood, family, children, and nation. And I argue new ideas of fatherhood as well. As the sources make clear, the Shikkito Sampradaya of colonial Bengal took the middle-class child to be the future citizen subject if male, and to be the good mother and housewife if female. The extent to which this new ideology was impinged upon the new domestic culture and visions of a reformed womanhood unraveled in the lived experiences of women that we are going to examine today. My paper works in tandem with the history of domesticity and is animated by debates on historicizing fatherhood. The history of Indian fathers or fatherhood is yet to be written. The only historical studies on fatherhood comes from psychoanalysts and scholars of Indic literature. Sudhir Kakkar, in particular, has emphasized the nature of Indian fathers as distant and removed from the daily lives of children. On the other hand, if we historicize the fathers under discussion in the context of the 19th century, they were subjects of global historical processes, and their behavior and concerns resonated with that of fathers from Victorian and Edwardian England. So I'm talking about the period from 1840s through 1901, 1910. Marked by an industrializing society and an expanding empire, Victorian fathers seem to be in a state of flux. Although scholars rightly warn against confining fathers to specific stereotypes, John Tosh, the pioneer of masculinity studies in Victorian England, identified 4 distinct patterns of Victorian fathers. They are the absent and distant father, who, responding to the exigencies of economic demands and compelling cultural factors in mid-19th century England, led an itinerant lifestyle. Number 2, protective father, involved in raising children on a day-to-day basis. Number 3, the playful father, who spontaneously engaged with children and expressed intense grief over loss of offspring. And number 4, the tyrannical father, who used corporal punishment of disciplining the child. Although the context and subject positions of Indian fathers in a colonized state was vastly different from the Victorians, they also exhibited distance, protectiveness, playfulness, and tyranny in dealing with children. But the composite image of fathers from children's accounts renders a more complicated picture. In Bengali children's imaginings, fathers were figures of supreme veneration, not necessarily as providers, but as moral icons. The image of Adarsha Pita, or ideal father, though not sanctified in advice manuals, ran parallel to that of the Adarsha Janani, or ideal mother. Narratives from daughters, because of their differential treatment and socialization, add another dimension to practices of fatherhood by demonstrating the latter's affection, vulnerability, and ambivalence. So now a few words about my sources. The most direct images of strong and authoritative fathers emerge from autobiographical literature that also registers the emotions and sensibilities revealed in everyday life. By drawing on personal narratives, I aim to explore how fathers were imagined by adult children, especially women. The narratives are not held as authentic, but as mediums of representations, with all their complexities that offer myriad possibilities of reading and interpretation. Autobiographies, as a literary genre, evolved at the intersection of profound changes in colonial Bengal and India. Sudipta Kobiraj claims that the authority holds a peculiarly significant place in the inauguration of new forms of social life because it describes and reflectively comments on real, not fictive lives. Although autobiographies are closer to real lives, they are nonetheless narratives and thus fictive in their own way. What adult women recounted about their childhood relationship with their fathers was in some sense idealized, insofar as the authors stressed certain aspects of the relationship over others and included or excluded anecdotes accordingly. The biggest caveat of personal narratives is the reliance on memory, which is always fragmented, discontinuous, selective, and often incomplete. Memory, whether individual or collective, is after all socially produced. Imagination, therefore, played a significant role in this reconstruction of father-child relationship. Now, having said that, the stories that women and men told about fathers reflected sociocultural expectations for fatherhood as much as they reflect everyday practices. Although people's stories relate everyday practice, they are nonetheless narratives and thus reflect sociocultural mores about fatherhood. And it also reflects literary conventions. So it was not just merely a catalog of daily events. As far as those depictions go, there are four tropes that recur in these narratives: a tension between distance and intimacy, the differential importance of modern education. For girls, early marriages were deemed more important than education as opposed to boys, obedience and fulfilling expectations of a patriarchal family throughout life, and finally, enforcement of discipline, expectations, and chastisement. The different facets of a father, venerable, affectionate, ambivalent, and strict, were intertwined and dependent on one another. To cast these dynamics in sharper relief, let us now segue to the voices from within, self-writings of women that relate experiences with fathers. Now, among hundreds of personal narratives left by women, I really chose only a handful that are representative of class and gender ideologies at work at that time. So it's not by any means an exhaustive study of all women's writings. I just carefully chose two. These are two reflections I thought as very, very apt. The first one, for a woman to be a good wife and a good mother is far better than to be able to write MA or BA after her name. This is actually a quote from Keshav Chandra Sen, and it is noted in his daughter's autobiography, Shuniti Devi. The other one is also, for 5 years, a son shall be treated with great tenderness. For 10 years, he shall be subjected to rigorous discipline. When he attains his 16th year, the father shall treat his son as a friend. And this comes from the autobiography of Bipin Chandra Pal, who has written exhaustively about his father. So, Memories of My Life and Times. And I know, and you all know that this quote comes from Chanakya Niti, where how a son's role is delineated in those ancient texts. So let us start with the accounts from the Tagore family. So I show Devendranath as the first figure. So accounts written by daughters from prominent families, noting the outpouring of affection and of their beloved fathers, further affirm that the Indian or the Victorian stereotype of a distant, cold, and aloof father did not dominate social relations, between Bengali fathers and daughters of the period under consideration. But the preference for sons as a cultural capital for carrying on family name, lineage, and social and economic security is well known, clear from Bipin Chandra's Pal's quotes. Daughters' remembrances harped on affection and attention they received from their fathers. No doubt, women who wrote their lives represented a privileged group who received necessary education to express themselves in writing. Most educated women who wrote conformed to the ideology of the Bhadra Mohila, the respectable lady, and did not challenge the patriarchal values imposed upon them. So I will again, begin with a selective example of the illustrious Tagore family. There are many more writings which I did not consider for the talk. An image of the venerable father who enjoyed considerable public presence emerged from the writings of the Tagore family of Jorashako, Kolkata. The wealth of information shared by female and male family members through 3 successive generations of the aristocratic Tagore family offers a complex portrait of the venerable father embodied in Maharshi Debendranath Tagore, a foremost leader of the reformist Brahmo Samaj, a father who traversed the public-private world and held a respectable position in Bhadralok circles of colonial Bengal. The public persona of Father Debendranath as a social and religious reformer was too important for his daughters. Shodamini Devi, his eldest daughter, and Shawna Kumaridevi, the youngest, they have left extensive accounts of their fathers, but Shodamini Devi's work is lesser known to us. So Shodamini Devi always stayed with her husband and children in her natal residence at Jorashako, and was a prime commander of the large Tagore household. She dedicated her life taking care of her father and the rest of the family. In Pitri Sriti, where she reminisced her father following his death, Shodamini drew the most intimate portrait of Debendranath. She recounted how his role as a social reformer, as a reformed Hindu and a monotheist, extended into familial life. She emphasized her father's concern for the appropriate kind of women's education, the way he replaced the Vaishnavi tutor by an Indian Christian woman for their everyday lesson. Once a week, a Mem Sahib or an Anglo-Indian European lady tutor would give them Bible lessons. Dissatisfied with the quality of home education, Debendranath was among the first few fathers to send his daughter Shodamini and her cousin to the newly opened Bethune School in 1848. Shodamini also noted Debendranath's zeal for a holistic education for girls that included indigenous forms of arts and aesthetics. For example, the Tagore girls were taught to do alpona or rangoli specific to each occasion. Shodamini narrated how she fostered artistic skills among his daughters, reformed women's clothing, and underscored their moral and spiritual upliftment. Indirectly addressing Debendranath's conservatism, Shodamini figuratively wrote in his defense, and I quote, "In the path of social reform, people who follow the fast track criticize the slowness and conservatism of my father. They forget that the roads back in those days were meant for walking. You had to exert yourself in every step. Now cars run speedily on the same streets. That does not allow the riders to think that they are more powerful than the pedestrians. It is also worth considering that if the car blindly sped through those streets, it might not have spelled well for its riders." End quote. So as much as Shodamini admired her father, the father too expressed his high praise and reliance on her in the 2 letters he wrote to her. According to Debendranath, the 3 principal attributes that adorned her daughter Shodamini were, number 1, her pious nature, number 2, her extreme reverence for her father, and number 3, her superb domestic skills. These 3 qualities, if we recall, are very, very resonant of the Victorian era. And they also became the defining virtues of the Bengali girl child. A specific kind of education envisioned for girls were geared towards fulfilling their ideals of domesticity as good mothers, wives, and daughters. Now, Devendranath's more celebrated daughter, Shawna Kumaridevi, a writer, poet, musician, and social worker, also proudly recorded the social activism of her father. In a short memoir, Shekele Kotha, or Tales from the Past, Shawna Kumaridevi dwelt mainly on the education and status of women of her generation and underscored her father's and also her elder brother Satyendranath's contribution to women's cause. She claimed that if Rammohn Roy was the first to initiate religious reforms, her father pioneered the social reforms that fought for education of women, eradication of child marriage, and advocated civilized or reformed attire for Bengali women. The word she uses is Shushobh Poshak. She upheld the role of Debendranath as one of the few fathers in Bengal who sent their daughters to Bethune School. Shaunakumari echoed her older sister by initiating family members to the new principles of Brahmoism. Debendranath introduced a comprehensive education for all women in the Tagore household. He also removed idolatrous Hindu practices, and particularly those that discriminated against women. All his daughters learned science and got trained in new and improved methods of learning taught by Pandits and Mem Sahibs, combining the best of the East and the West. Devendranath maintained strict supervision as to what his children were learning. Opposed to mechanical forms of learning, once he found out that the governess was making the girls copy what she wrote on a slate, he immediately dismissed her and breaking all conventions, he assigned a better teacher, a male teacher, Ajodhanath Pakrashi, who is also a male outsider in women's quarters, for further educating Tagore daughters. Shaunakumari regretted that whenever her father was away, the education of Tagore women within the household was neglected. Shaunakumari boldly asserted that Debendranath raised the age of marriage for girls and the Tagore family and scripted a new form of marriage. In 1868, Shaunakumari was married at age 13 to 27-year-old Janakinath Ghoshal, a strong-willed man who was disavowed by his own zamindari family by endorsing Brahmoism and entering into this marriage with the daughter of a Brahmo leader. Age 13 for Shaunakumari actually indicated the later age of marriage for Tagore girls. Instead of a Brahmin priest, Debendranath presided over the occasion following new rules of marriage that he designed for the Brahmos. For Shaunakumari, her father Mahorshi Debendranath was as important at home as he was for the wider public. As far as raising the age of marriage was concerned, Debendranath held a double standard. While he pushed the age of marriage for his daughter to 13, he adhered to older norms of choosing very young brides between 8 and 10 for his celebrated sons. Ironically, none of the daughters questioned this double standard. Debendranath was also opposed to his daughters and daughters-in-law traveling outside home or making their presence in public life. But none of his children, daughters and sons, openly objected to such reservations. Even the fiery feminist and nationalist leader, Sharula Devi Chaudhurani, daughter of Shawna Kumaridevi, reminisced about her own birth by saying, "Yet another granddaughter was born to the Mahorshi." Instead of any reference to her parents, she noted her arrival with respect to her illustrious maternal grandfather, Debendranath, the Mahorshi. Her birth was not celebrated with fanfare, as she noted, but the family made sure that they observed the birth rituals following the newly founded Brahmo religion. Debendranath's glory was such that his children and grandchildren carefully shelved any defiance, anger, or love. Instead, they paid their homage to the godlike image of the restrained Mahorshi. They did not openly discuss, at least not in print, his control over family estate, and the way he conducted business in real life. In defense of the distant father Devendranath, his daughters and granddaughters exalted him as the most venerable figure, a public leader of a newly formed community, and the patriarch in his family by his own right. Shodamini's minutiae of his father's daily life and Shawna Kumari's focus on the public career of her father as a religious and social reformer obliterated the sharp division between the private and the public. Let us, from the Tagore family, let us now consider the case of the social reformer Keshav Chandra Sen and his daughter Shuniti Devi. Keshav Chandra Sen was an eminent advocate of women's education. He opened schools for girls and encouraged missionaries like Margaret Cousins to come and teach Indian women. Keshav Chandra Sen also got embroiled in a major worldwide controversy surrounding the marriage of his daughter Shuniti Devi. A votary of the Marriage Act of 1872 that increased the age of marriage for Indian girls and boys, Sen arranged the marriage of his underage daughter Shuniti with the Maharaja of Kuch Bihar. And this story is known to most of the Bengalis, so I'm not repeating it. But far from a critical stance on her father's position, Shuniti Devi, in her autobiography, voiced a strong defense for her father. She celebrated the contribution of her father toward women's causes. Again, she described him as, and I quote, one of the most remarkable men India has ever produced, and noted that he founded the Native Ladies Normal School and a college for girls named after Queen Victoria. At the same time, she mentioned that her father maintained, and I quote again, for a woman to be a good wife and a good mother is far better than to be able to write MA or BA after her name. Shuniti Devi defended her father's decision to marry her off by acceding to his ideology and emphasized that he yielded to the pressure of the colonial government. She recorded in meticulous details how the affectionate father Keshav Sen broke the news to her that the Maharaja's family was coming to see her for marriage. Dedicated to her studies and unprepared for this abrupt decision, she had no prior knowledge about this. Shuniti was devastated, especially for being pulled out of school to be married to the prince. She was opposed to marriage at that young age, but she complied with her father's discretion without a challenge and noted that she had a fulfilling married life. Echoing the sentiment of the time, she indicated that obeying the commands of parents constituted the chief obligation of children. She thus happily agreed with the decision of her father and led a successful married life. For the reformist fathers, education and the character formation of children, and especially marital customs and practices, had a different implication when it pertained to daughters. Education and marriage stood in contradistinction to each other, and with respect to girls, particularly in late colonial Bengal. So my third example is Hoimaboti Sen, or rather my fourth example. Despite facing odds, women continued to offer favorable pictures of their fathers. Hoimaboti Sen, who recounted her life from being a child bride to a lady doctor, was frank enough to describe her landowning father, Prasanna Kumar Ghosh, as an alcoholic and given to licentiousness. Acknowledging, and I quote her, that drinking and debauchery were ritual duties in those days among zamindars, end quote, she spoke about the large-heartedness of her father and the kindness and generosity that made up for his vices. She noted with great pride that upon her birth, and again I quote from Hoimabati, father was so pleased that he ordered celebratory music for an entire month, and the house was illuminated with wreaths of lamps, end quote. He commanded, no one must describe my child as a girl. My daughter has no less rights than those which accrue to other people's sons. He looked upon Hoimabati as his firstborn son and declared in no uncertain terms that he would have nothing to do with anybody who treated her with contempt because of her gender. So he would even give her a male name, Chuni Babu. She continued to be her father's pet until 6 or 7, dressed in boys' clothes, and spent most of her time in the outer quarter of the house. And although, as a girl child, she was not supposed to be educated, she had a high standing with one teacher to whom she gave her father's tobacco and delicious tidbits of food. Soon thereafter, unknown to the female members of the household who opposed the education of the girl child, Hoimabuti's father arranged her education with a tutor. Her mother, on the other hand, was so disappointed at her birth that she took to her sick bed in sorrow and disappointment, and she spent her days in tearful sorrow. Hoimaboti recalled repeatedly the neglect she received from her mother. Equally fierce and ill-disposed were the other female members of the family. At the end, their wishes prevailed, and 9-year-old Hoimaboti was married to a 45-year-old man. In the days immediately following the marriage, both at her natal home and in the in-laws, Hoimaboti frantically looked for her father. Breaking all conventions, her father came to see her at her in-laws in the first week of her marriage. But customs and cultural practices stood in the way of getting her immediately out of the in-laws' house. Regretting how he yielded to social pressure and married his dear daughter off, Hoimabati's father had to intervene shortly after the wedding to rescue her from the old and wealthy husband whom Hoimabati described as a drunkard and a whoremonger. Hoimabati still had to go back to her in-laws and stay there until her husband died within a year when she was 10 years old. This time, her father finally took her back, but he himself died shortly thereafter. In both cases of Shuniti and Hoimabati, fathers were remembered as affectionate and were favorably disposed toward their daughters, but they were vulnerable to social and cultural pressures that revealed their ambivalent position. Now, the next example, and all these pictures come from Jerry's collections, and she has also edited both the memoirs that I'm drawing from Hoimabati's and Shudha Majumdar's. Contrary to the popular conception that fathers favored sons, several women noted how their fathers celebrated their birth. Shudha Majumdar began her memoir with an excerpt from her father's diary. Again, I quote, "Wife brought to bed of a daughter." The entry was dated 22nd March, the year 1899. My advent had been important enough to be noted down by my father, end quote. Shudha's father, unlike Hoimabati's, was an educated, westernized man from a landowning family in Bengal. He was a member of the Indian Civil Service and a staunch supporter of British rule. Shudha recalled that at a time when women's education was restricted, he set up a radical example by sending Shudha to a private missionary school, St. Teresa's Convent, that many of us are familiar with, much to the consternation of her mother, who considered her husband's decision as foolhardy and irresponsible. Shudha shared minute details about everyday interactions with her father. Shudha's father did not discriminate against her as a daughter. He would coax and feed Shudha the forbidden food like chicken cutlet cooked by his Muslim cook, as he would also do with his sons. Generous and charitable by nature, her father would sometimes have Shudha accompany him in his afternoon outings. Dressed in her best outfit and a straw hat, it was an ordeal for Shudha, as she would have to sit still and bored, watching the passing streets and people, while her father was absorbed in his own thoughts. The distance and awe that Shudha felt with her father was obvious from her description. Shudha portrayed his manliness by emphasizing his anglicized manners, habits, and practices. The connection between eating practices, knowledge of English, and masculinity have already been established by scholars. He nurtured, likewise, so what we see in Shudha's depiction of his father is his kind of manly practices. So he nurtured two hobbies, horses and health, that resonated with the rising trend of the westernized masculine culture. And again, I quote from Shudha, a small quote. In a specially built gymnasium, her father, like he, exercised regularly and kept magnificent health in old age, end quote. He never ate the common food for the family. And again, I quote, he dieted according to every book on dieting, experimenting to discover what was best for him. His diet was composed according to an English recipe book of meat and fish, boiled, baked, or steamed, and vegetables, end quote. So diet and exercise, which constituted healthy body and mind of a man, characteristics that were discussed in the pages of scientific journals, were thus quintessential for the man that Shudha's father was. Despite his pronounced cultivation of manly characteristics, he, like most men of his class and era, agreed to marry his daughter off at age 12, interrupting her education. He could not stand above family pressure, and his dual standard with respect to his girl child was apparent. Shudha, like Shuniti, was also fortunate to have a companionate-style romantic marriage. Another example. The mother of the celebrated feminist scholar Malavika Karlekar and the daughter and granddaughter of Indian civil servants, Monika Chanda, and her memoir is replete with intimate memories of her father, Gyanendranath Gupta. Each of the 22 short chapters in her memoir recalled memories of close interaction with her elite, westernized father. Her father, this is a picture of her parents. Her father, too, like Shuniti's, Hoimabati's, and Shudha's, did not stake a claim for her education. Monika's daughter, Malavika Karlekar, in her editor's note, wrote, "It is interesting that despite their wide learning and commitment to education as an ideal, neither Monika's maternal grandfather, Arsidat, an eminent member of the ICS, nor his son-in-law laid much store in girls' education." End quote. Monika traveled far and abroad with her father, but regretted that her parents did not take her piano lessons or education seriously. And Karlekar, her daughter, rightly noted, and I quote Karlekar, "Monika's life can be read as a metaphor, an icon of the encounters between cultures, where a father reared in the indigenous tradition and then acculturated into the ICS ethics with strict sexual division of labor was avowedly against formal schooling for girls." So this far, I have kind of shown a stereotype of a father who were torn between girls' education and marriage. So let me just bring into attention some exceptions here. Two prolific women writers, Shanta Devi and Shita Devi, daughters of the famous writer, editor, journalist, and educator Ramananda Chattopadhyay, fondly reminisced about their progressive, affectionate father. Ramananda Chattopadhyay, a member of the Brahmo community and a close associate of the Tagores, as we know, gave leadership to three significant journals in colonial India, Dashi, Probashi, and the Modern Review. Ramananda was an ardent advocate of progressive social reforms and offered a sharp critique of colonial education and imperialist practices. His daughter, Shanta Devi, wrote a biography of her father, Bharat Mukti Sadhak Ramananda o Ardha Shatabdir Bangla, and then a memoir called Purvosriti. Both sisters got their BA degrees and lived an active intellectual life. Their experiences proved to be different from the examples I discussed so far. Neither Shanta nor Shita were subjected to child marriage or were deprived of education. In Purvosriti, Shanta Devi fondly noted early memories with her father, especially during their stay in Allahabad, where they spent their early years. Vignettes of Shantadevi's memoirs, such as going to Brahmo prayers with her father every Sunday morning, her father assisting her with cooking when everyone fell sick, and 8-year-old Shanta had to take charge of the household, attested to Ramananda's protective stance and close engagement with his family. Certain incidents Shanta Devi related especially evinced the intimacy with her father. When Shanta was about 10 years old, she would often fall asleep in the open courtyard, as was the norm in northern India. When the rain came all of a sudden, her father would pick her up and transfer to the room. Shanta Devi, through her nostalgic reminiscences of a very rich and eventful life, averred that she never lost touch with her dear father as long as he was alive. The underlying tensions and inconsistencies that often characterized father-daughter relationship were absent between Ramananda and his daughters. Now, let me complicate the picture by positing some exceptions to this kind of conformist and obedient father-daughter relationship. Let me now bring into the picture a risk-taking and also delinquent daughters who defied their fathers and from whose accounts we can recover the raging authority of fathers as strict disciplinarians. In her autobiography, Pagdondi, Leela Mojumdar, recalling her childhood spent in the absolute bliss in the foothills of the Himalayas and northeastern India, wrote, "In spite of having the supreme sense of happiness and security, my father was very strict. He had no doubt that severe spanking was mandatory to raise healthy children. My father was prepared to sacrifice everything for us, but he roared out so loud at the slightest acts of disobedience that our hands and feet froze. As a matter of fact, I never got along well with my father, and later in life, we parted company forever. Whatever it was, as a child, I used to avoid my father, but at the same time, I had great respect for him." Mojumdar's father, like Shudha Mojumdar and Monica Chandas, was a representative of the successful professional middle class. He worked for the colonial government, was posted in different locales within India, and harbored sensibilities that constituted the Shikhito Bhadralok Sampradaya. Leela Majumdar vividly recalled the intensity of the slap that her father inflicted on her when she chewed on a plum stone that she picked from his empty plate. She also recounted his superb physical strength, extraordinary courage, and sportsmanship, qualities that were highly valued by Indian males, especially in the face of British criticism. Her uncle, her father's elder brother, who actually raised her father, also nurtured a similar belief towards spanking, but he spared the girls. Leela's father did not. Leela Majumdar narrated instances of playfulness that her father exhibited toward children, but the children never overcame the distance that grew out of extreme fear of his father's anger, temper, and punishment. Majumdar's expressions were bold and less inhibited, perhaps because she had already lost connection with her father following her choice of marriage partner. It is possible, and this is where I surmise and ask a question, that relative to the Tagores, Leela Majumdar's family, which was of significant importance in the Calcutta social milieu, but nonetheless comparatively lesser than the Tagores, probably allowed her to publicly pronounce her vexed relationship with her father. Or we can give Leela Majumdar more in terms of her defiant spirit, which she always had. So in the another example, and I will end with that, in the Bengali sociocultural landscape, falling out with fathers on grounds of choosing marriage partners and romantic love was a common experience among women and men. The multitudes of instances bring home the aristocratic and hurtful regimes of fathers. Now, the expert is among us. I'm not going to talk about it, and we'll hear more from her. The semi-autobiographical novel, Nahannate of the writer and social activist Moitrey Devi, daughter of the well-known philosopher Surendranath Dasgupta, stands out in that respect. Nahannate is redolent of a lost romance and unrequited love, was penned as a response to the novel Bengali Nights by the Indologist Micha Iliad, with whom the author had an affair, and it was an exceptional critique. This text is an exceptional critique of the author's father, who was renowned worldwide for his scholarship. Raised in a liberal upper caste Hindu household, Moitrey Devi, a poet and a precocious daughter of a philosopher, powerfully recreates a teenage romance when she was 16 with her father's Romanian student, Mircea Euclid. The name was changed in the novel, then 23. When the secret love affair became known to the family, her father banished Mircea from their home. 42 years later, when Moitrey Devi relived that unfulfilled romance, she also left a daring testimony to the brutality and double standards of her father and her family. Thus, she introduced her father as follows. My father was a very learned man, in fact, a versatile genius. He is well known for his erudition and feared by many because of it. His scholarship is aggressive. He can easily reduce a person in argument to shambles. He's very fond of this game. Yet, he has a hypnotic charm. People cling to him, his students are devoted to him and will go to any length to support him. He also loves them, but that is different. That is a different kind of love. There is no sympathy in it. He loves them for his own sake and not theirs. For example, he loves me not for me so much as for himself. My father is full of me, yet I know if I dare go against him, the littlest bit, he won't hesitate to crush me ruthlessly. My likes and dislikes are immaterial. I have to be happy at his command. End quote. This critical commentary on her father as an aristocratic patriarch lingers through the novel, in which history and fiction deftly mingled. Thanks to her family's elite status, Moitrey Devi grew up in a rich cultural milieu and enjoyed illustrious company, including that of Rabindranath Tagore. But her father's social conservatism and intervention stood in the way of consummating her love. The pages of this autobiographical novel strongly registered her disenchantment and anger with her father as she candidly recorded his hypocrisy, extramarital affair, and self-centeredness. Now, with this, I end my examples and my last few words about what I come to conclusion about this, my readings of these sources. So when we read these writings, or memoirs, it is important to focus on how the children positioned themselves in these narratives. The storytelling children, recounting austere, sanctimonious, affectionate, caregiving fathers, were active constituents of the emotional expressions defining filial relationships. If anger was recalled as the dominant emotion among the fathers expressing power and control, the response it elicited from children was that of fear, as we noticed in the case of Leela Majumdar and Moitrey Devi. Yet fear alone could not keep the youthful impulses under control. Majumdar's choice of her marriage partner as a young adult is a pertinent example of a risk taker. Moitrey Devi took the refuge of literary imagination to defy all conventions and shame her celebrity father by revealing his secrets. Disobedience of children challenged the ordained behavior expected of them by their parents. By crossing the boundaries, they were at risk of being subjected to brutal physical and moral chastisement, and in extreme scenarios of losing their relationship with their fathers. So the father-daughter relationship was a register of social life that unfolded in a changing socioeconomic and political context of colonial Bengal. The unpacking of various emotions recorded in father-daughter experiences revealed the nature of changes that filial relationship underwent in the late colonial era. Belying the stereotypes of a distant, cold, and aloof father, voices of women mostly spoke about close and affectionate relationships with fathers. But their memories also document the underlying tension and accommodation on the part of the daughters and the fathers. Compared to the father-son relationship, which was often marked by a power struggle, something that I did not get into in this discussion, daughters' recollection of fathers offered a more variegated and compromised picture of filial relationship. The crucial points of tension between fathers and daughters revolved around the latter's education and marriage. On the one hand, the Bhadralok fathers, imbued with new ideas of modernity and progress, were committed to girls' education. On the other, most of them were committed to old-style community and family values, particularly relating to girls' education and marriage. Some of them overcame their gender bias and son preference when they celebrated birth of daughters and were willing to educate them. But most of them did not rise above their caste class prejudices and were vulnerable to communal customs and social pressures. But that did not stop daughters from idealizing and defending their fathers. Several daughters, like Shuniti Devi, made special effort to absolve their fathers of any blame. The memories of venerable fathers by daughters brought alive their ambivalence and tension. The rather generous, forgiving recounting of fathers by their daughters testified to the reality that the fathers, although vulnerable, were the ultimate decision makers and arbiters of justice at home. Masculinity and manhood, waged through authority and power over family members, were always constructed by social norms. And in our case, when it came to a choice between daughters' education and marriage, the inverse relationship between women's education and marriage, I argue, is directly connected to control of women's sexuality and reproduction. Daughters' productive and reproductive labor were critical for the maintenance of the social order. Paternal authority was strongly tied to economic relationships as established particularly by colonial law. The importance of biological fathers was related to changing property rights. Property rights and obligations of fathers were further complicated by processes of urbanization, migration from rural to urban setups, and the development of new professional, educational, and financial institutions under the colonial regime. Among both Hindus and Muslims, familial conflicts with parental authorities, both mothers and fathers, gave rise to nucleated households. Keshav Chandra's family is a case in point. With the diffusion of familial responsibilities and obligations, specific meanings ascribed to gender, age, education, and marital status of girl children became crucial for the upwardly mobile community in late colonial India. As fathers were caught in the middle, so were most of the daughters who conformed to the hegemonic patriarchal ideologies as they defended their fathers. The father-daughter interaction revealed that the practice of fatherhood was an equally important component of the same patriarchy that subjected women to new ideological parameters at the close of the 19th century. The fathers, as literate members of the Bengali middle class, were at risk of criticism by the colonial government, but their paternal expressions of love, protection, control, and discipline acted as an attribute and vector of colonial masculinity. The enunciative and performative aspects of fatherhood, representing shifting sets of ideas and practices over time, revealed ambivalent and conflicted sensibilities of the colonized subjects on the one hand, and the latter's bid for hegemony over women, children, and other subaltern groups on the other. So the overarching theme that underscored the father-child relationship was that of veneration and a special kind of moral education that was heavily gendered, contingent on the sex of the child. Whether a father was an eminent public figure, a patriarch riddled with contradictions, or a raging disciplinarian, the Indian father was always remembered with respect, shraddha, and devotion, bhakti, with a few exceptions. With all his limitations and strength, the Indian father was not typically denied or rejected by his daughters. The rule of the father prevailed, and his behavior and emotions were a testament to the prevailing expectations of manhood and the hegemonic possibilities in the domain of the home and family. Women's recollections of fathers signal the process that went into the making of the new man when domesticity became a motor of change. Meanings attached to manliness, such as respect, devotion, strength, courage, and uprightness, were inextricably linked to the virtues of fatherhood, imagined by children, and especially daughters. But the very process of remembering and defending fathers also restores women with their own agency, albeit accommodating to patriarchal practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawna Di, for the illuminating lecture. So please, Professor Geraldine Forbes. Jerry, are you here? Jerry, are you online? Hello? Hello, Professor Jerry? I think she must be busy somewhere.
Joined.
She has joined, but I don't know whether she's online or not.
Jerry, are you there? Yes, she's here.
Yeah. Jerry,
back.
yeah.
Sorry. Sorry. So usually that happens to other people, but it just happened to me. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so Shawna was just concluding when my internet went off. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Jerry, we
Oh,
can hear you. Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes. I couldn't hear anyone else. All right, I'm sorry. Do you want me to begin now? Or I'm sorry, because
Jerry, please, we want to hear your comments and observations. Yes.
okay, thank you. First, actually, to Aparna and Vaswati for actually setting up this conclave. I think during the depth of our depression, in 2020, actually, this was just fabulous to be back in contact. So I'm so glad that you've kept it going. And actually, I've learned to think like this is amazing. We can get across, we can talk to people in other countries and get people on from different continents. So I just want to thank the two of you and for inviting me, and to Swapna for actually a book I've read some of it in manuscript, so I don't have the whole book yet. I think with all of us, we're waiting for it to come out. I think Swapna's heard that it's published, but I could just see publication dates that it would be available not until maybe October and November for the rest of us. Actually, this book has, when I was thinking about this talk, my first reaction was, Swapna just takes on these really, really hard, difficult topics. And since I've known her since she was a graduate student working on her PhD, at the time it was, what, you're going to try to work on domestic workers, and I'm fully aware of the struggle that was involved. And I was just, when I was thinking about today, pull this one out. So men, women, and domestics. So we go back to about 1995 in terms of Swapna's work. All right. So after that struggle to think about how do we capture as historians the neglected people in history, after that one, Swapna then thought, all right, let's move to another difficult, almost impossible topic, and took on children and now fatherhood. And what I think is, you know what, I'm when you, the rest of you see this book, and you probably already know many of her articles. I know Gunja and many of you are very aware, and Sanjukta Dasgupta is on. You know Swapna's work, and you know other chapters, and you know like how exhaustive her search has been. And I think that's, I mean, that's one of the things that deeply impresses me. And it's not just like her look through, you know, archives and so on, but the reaching out to all kinds of other fields and working out to people who work in totally different cultures and societies and time periods. I think this is what's impressive. So I think I just wanted to say that that's something for like all of us to just celebrate, is this exhaustive search. And Swapna and I, when we were talking about, she said, yes, but there's going to be people who hear me today who know that I missed something. But I think, yeah, probably we all do. But this is really an extraordinary piece of research. All right. I'm just going to, I think, as you know from the talk, this is really, really a really important work. Actually, it's just not been talked about. And I think it's reading Swapna that I'm going like, yeah, we've got so much about mothers and wives and advice manuals, and there's so many things we've looked at, but not this. So that actually, I think this was like really, like, why haven't we talked about fathers? I mean, we know so many of these men in their roles as leaders of the community and social reformers, but not looked at them. So her effort here to bridge the public and the private, the domestic and the political, I think this is one of the things that stands out to me that make this a model. I think, and what I looked at particularly today was the draft chapter of the work on autobiography, and I was struck, and I am again by the talk, in a way in which Swapna teaches us or gives us a model of how to read autobiography. I think, you know, so often there is this tendency to read autobiography as, oh, this is what happened. But I think her focus on the imaginary, on imagined fathers not real, is important. I absolutely loved her point that in the process of remembering, which again is a certain kind of construction, that there's a kind of restoration of women's agency. I'm just going to mention a couple of other things that really appeal to me. Oh, and just to mention, I think all of you know that Swapna again goes from her own work to domestics, and then it was mentioned in the introduction, her work on children, her work on fatherhood, and now she's engaged in this really extensive project on ayahs, and recently she shared some of her material on like traveling ayahs, her look at visual history. So that's what we have to look forward to. All right, I love the difference because I'm familiar with some of these memoirs, not with others, and I actually thought that I haven't even thought so much about the ones I've mixed. I was really struck by both Shuddha Majumdar and Hoymabati Shen in the way that they celebrate their fathers as again, I mean, Shawna points out that Hoimabati Shen really breaks with tradition in saying that her father is both a drunk and a debauched guy, but that was what all of these men were like at the time. Both, I was always struck with those memoirs about these two women saying, my father was so wonderful to me, but he gave in. He gave in, and both of these young women, when they were children, really loved education. They loved studying and wanted to continue. And then their fathers gave in. This is how they present them. I actually really appreciate the way that Shawna says, all right, so we have these fathers who gave in, but then we have these fathers, we have fathers who didn't give in, right? So, and we've got the same time period, and then also pointing out two women who were highly critical of their fathers. So I think she gives us a whole sense, and I think what I expect many of you listening to this today, and when you read the book, you will be like me, in that suddenly you're searching for things you didn't look for before. She's raising questions for us. She's suggesting ways to look at these questions, to look at our sources that I think I have ignored before. I really just think this is going to be a book that has a huge impact on work in the future. And I think, I mean, there are so many things Shawna raised that I think we can't, that I just don't think that I'm either really qualified to talk about. I really like the way that she's exploring, again, manhood, masculinity, changing masculinity in this intersection between the private and the public. I haven't actually, even though maybe I've looked at these men, I haven't thought about some of those ways in which they interacted with their daughters. So, all right. So I'm going to open it now to questions. So could I have people, come on and mention that, okay, you'd like to comment. I just think that there's so many people who have a wealth from their own research, their own studies, their own writing, that are going to add something to this conversation. Who have we got? Oh, all right. I'm seeing people I didn't see before. All right.
Yes, can I?
Achut? Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Jerry. Hi, Shawna.
Hi there.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to see both of you together, and it was such an amazing talk. And I'm really, when I'm being part of, not exactly a part of, but I remember all the conversations we had the last time we were working on the book. Now, I will not ask questions about the book, but a few questions that come to my mind, because it's just a coincidence. 2 days back, I was talking to a scholar who wanted to work on children's literature, and was because you mentioned Leela Majumdar. So I was just wondering if, I can already see huge implication of this work for a history of childhood in India, especially in Bengal, and very clear distinction between the girl child and the male child, and that becomes very apparent even at the very template of the book, invites our attention to look at that. So that is something that I believe this book also contributes to, and I'm sure future generation of readers will bring it up. But what I really want to know from you is a question about the mothers, because you talk about the fathers all the time, and I was being curious, where were the mothers during all this time, and did these women or men, they remembered their mothers, and to a larger for a larger purpose, I mean, how would this book contribute to the history of parenting in India or parenting in Bengal? Because so it's about parenting, but only one part of parenting, fathering a child. what about mothering a child? Because that's, I believe, would be the sequel that maybe you have already thought about. Yeah.
May I respond? Harshadi? Yeah, thank you, Achyut, for asking this question. And it's really lovely to see you all now that I can see all your faces, because when I was speaking, I could not see any of you. Yes, that's a very, very pertinent question. So first, as a historian, I will tackle it historiographically. There's a lot of historiographical literature on motherhood. I have myself written on motherhood, on my mother-child relationship in the past, based primarily on domestic manuals and also autobiographies. So there has been a lot of talk about the new woman, Adarsha Janani, Shugrihini, and for example, Professor Samita Sen, she inaugurated this by addressing this whole notion of motherhood and mothercraft, how that impinged even on the working class people in colonial India. There has been enough historiographical literature on motherhood, on mothers, in the scholarship that is already prevalent in the scholarship. And in which ways? Because all these fathers, so these fathers, as I talk in my book, they're absent present. The Derridian concept of absent present. So they were there, and that's how. So this book actually has an accidental birth. I was not meaning to write about fathers. I was trying to recuperate children and childhood. That was how the project started decades ago. And when I went back to the sources, I found there was not a real child, but these were male writers whose authorial voices I was hearing through those texts. And they were addressing an imaginary audience who were these offspring of the new nation who will constitute the new nation, because they were all unfolding in the course of the last quarter of the 19th century. So, and there was a prolific body of literature on motherhood. I cannot tell you how many domestic manuals were written on being Shugrihini and Adarsha Janani, ideal mother. So I have addressed them, and how, and I actually addressed them in the context of discussing relationship with servants, how children were to be reared, what the mother should do, what kind of food they should do, how they were, revered as the ideal mother. And actually, a part of the book is on how girl children should be raised as ideal mothers and not as future citizens. So the citizenship, the notion of citizenship that I take up in other parts of the book, this is really a fraction of a chapter on autobiographical literature, but there has been a lot of discussion and talk on motherhood. And I have in my mind to take up the, further research on mother-child relationship from Queen Victoria, the queen mother, to the ordinary mothers. And I have written about Tagore mothers in the past. So there has been a lot of literature on mothers, but what is striking in the autobiographical literature of women is that they really exalt the father. Okay, they do not, you will know this character, for example, with the exception of Rani Chando, who writes Amar Mayer Bapir Bari, such a beautiful piece of literature. Women do not really extol their mothers as much as they do their fathers. And this is unfortunate. But that's also, and they talk about mothers, but they really extol their fathers in spite of all the limitations. And so I thought, maybe fathers who almost are omnipresent, but who do not consider themselves as a subject of investigation or construction, because fathers are everywhere. They are ubiquitous in their presence, and there was no question of addressing themselves as ideal fathers as opposed to ideal mothers. So that's why I said in the literature of normative texts, there are no mention of being an ideal father. And there was no public pronouncement of these fathers that I am the father. No. And in most of the male literature by fathers, they do not talk about their children. So it's a children's reconstruction of their fathers. And I know I have talked about men's autobiographies and women's autobiographies at length in other pieces I wrote, or even in this book. I did not get into all those theoretical discussion here. a woman's, individual self versus individual self. I'm not getting into there in today's talk, but they're all there, and there's a lot that has been written on motherhood, mothercraft, ideal mothers, but but father is completely absent because he's always there. So that absent presence paradigm works here.
Fantastic formula.
Thank you. Do we have, okay.
Mhm.
Someone else who'd like to raise a point? Actually, I just wanted to say, when Shawna and I corresponded with this earlier, I was looking at some of the advice manuals of an Assamese woman, Hema Prabha Das, who was 1886 to 1945. And Shawna, who knows, I asked her some questions about this, and it's really interesting. She has I'm just looking at my file. She has all of these things about, titled The Limits of a Woman's Duty, the duties of a mother, the ideal girl, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, nothing, women's education. You just go on, and nothing. Oh, there's one point in one of her articles saying, actually, the husband, after he gets married, shouldn't make his mother number one, right? But I think just this point that this is this left out topic. All right. Can I raise? This is Mandira Sen and Shawna. Could you address? Okay, I'm just going to see the comment.
Yeah.
Okay, Mandira said, what about Muslim fathers' daughters? Nur Jahan Begum was encouraged by her father, who founded Sagogat magazine, to be an editor, and she founded Begum, a magazine. And I know you addressed this in what I've read, but do you want to talk about it a bit? Yes.
Yes, Mandiradi. Yeah, there has been such a huge body of literature on this, that I basically examined for this project. I have not been, and the experiences of father-daughter relationship among the Muslim community is not much different from what we witnessed in the context of the Hindu or the Reformed Hindu communities. So absolutely, I have not read Nur Jahan Begum's works, but there are many other works by Muslim women. I was hoping if Professor Sonia Amin was here, she could have brought out a whole range of literary texts and autobiographies by Muslim women. But the father is still the most revered figure in a woman's life. There's a later publication, not on this period, called Indelible Imprints, where fathers were recalled by women. It came out of Jadavpur Women's Studies, maybe more than a decade ago. Where contemporary women recalled how fathers, and that's why they call it indelible imprints, how fathers left an impression in their memories of growing up. So the father, as the male figure, left a tremendous influence on women's lives. And perhaps if we interrogate these narratives, and I am sure, again, I'm deflecting from your question, Mandiradi, because I have not read the work that you are mentioning, but there are no dearth of works from the Muslim community who dealt with it in the same way, pretty much. Yeah, I will take a look. Definitely, I'll try to get a copy of it when I go to India next time. The copy of the book. Yeah.
So do we have other comments? We've got some just messages. Yes, messages saying great work and keep it up. Do we have some other comments that people would like to make? Here,
I think there is a comment from Sanjukta Sarkar.
Okay.
How did you navigate the bias of fondness and perhaps grudge that the daughters may have expressed in these accounts?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, Sanjukta. Well, these autobiographies, and this goes to answer several of your queries raised by Mondiradi and Achyut and others, that these autobiographies, I considered them as constructed narratives. And the girls or boys, they carefully chose what to present and what not to present. So I think Leela Majumdar and Moitri Devi were really two exceptions. You guys can bring to my notice if there are more defined daughters, but those are the two prominent daughters who came to my mind. And there are other, there are plenty of examples in literature that Aparna could actually, talk about. I did not go into the predominantly literary sources, but from those narratives, even say, even if we take the example of Leela Majumdar and also say Shudha Majumdar and others, all the narratives, we see they're recounting the fondness and affection that their fathers showed towards their daughters. It's not like they were not trying to they were not acknowledging because they were not because they also faced difficult situations in life. If take for example the autobiography of Shuniti Devi, but the grudge they carefully sealed. There are even when I worked on servants, and if you really rely on middle class narratives, you would see that there are some elements such as anger, punishment, chastisement, sexuality, that are very, very carefully sealed in or not talked about or erased in these middle class women's, Bhadra Mohila's narratives. On the other hand, if I look at the autobiographies of very few, but I closely look at the works of Baby Haldar, a present-day domestic worker, where we see a much more frank, open confession of sexual acts, even her own menstruation and things like that, which are not really present in the middle class women's narratives of the colonial era in particular. So for example, the principal example that comes to my mind, which captures both fondness and grudge, is that of Sarala Devi Chaudhurani. Jiboner Jhara Pata. If you look at it, she was very, very caustic about her parents' handling of children, because they were raised primarily by servants in the ambience of the illustrious household of the Tagores in Jorashako. And she did not approve a lot of how she was being handled or mishandled by her servants, by the maid Mongola who would slap her, and and she actually described her mother as the queen, the patricians, whereas she described her aunts coming from more humble backgrounds as plebeians. So, for example, in Sarala Devi's narrative, you see that she is actually veering between her grudge and fondness. She is definitely much more expressive of the illustrious background she comes from, but she is also a very strong voice. She represents a very strong voice among women of her generation, where she's also very critical of her aristocratic background. So you see both, but also you also have to, and that's why you have to look at the absences and the erasures and read against the grain to navigate what is being mixed, what is being missed. So, for example, the grudge part is a lot of times hidden. That's a hidden transcript in these narratives that you don't see.
Shunetra has posted a long comment in the chat box. Shunetra, could you unmute yourself and to speak? Yes, yeah.
Yes, Aparna, thank you for allowing me to speak. Yeah, this voice of father, it's kind of omnipresent. Whether it's in the childhood, in the rearing of a child, or when the child attains adulthood, the overarching presence of the father, that is always there. You cannot deny the voice of the father, whether he has been a caring father, whether he has been a doting father, does not matter. But the fact that he was the father and quote unquote the guardian of the child, that has mattered most. And what we find from these autobiographies, from these reminiscences, that is a tradition that is still being carried, on to the present. And in fact, I am just reminded of few incidents that I come across while traveling, when I travel by train across India, like families traveling together with children. I often find families, the mothers would not scold their children if the need arises. Rather, they would say, Papa ko kahungi, Papa akar pitega. That's a Hindi kind of thing that they are always saying. So the mother is present, but even then, she does not scold or she does not take the responsibility to discipline the child. Rather, it's again on the father, who is the agent to discipline the child. So this book, I guess, will create a sensation, because it's just not true for 19th century. It's true for 19th and 20th century. It's true for the present times as well. Maybe the father, because the father provided, that's why he is given so much importance, despite the fact that it's the mothers behind the scenes who does the most in raising the kids. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this illuminating comment. Actually, you're right. And what is also very interesting, again, in terms of historiography, a lot of the literature, particularly relating to the history of emotions, is now coming out. The history of emotions in South Asia allude to the disciplinarian aspect of patriarchy, of fatherhood, of masculinity, where domestic manuals, especially even among the Muslims, which sanctions anger of the father. So if you look at Margaret Perner's work, she has written extensively on it, about how anger was sanctioned by the normative texts in Islamic literature in the context of South Asia. And also, I also agree with it if we go back a little bit into the feudal lineage of these Bengali middle class. And that's why I stress their location, that they were in a process of transition from the rural to the urban setup, that we see this kind of, sanctity of the father, and the rage of the father is a lot more pronounced in male autobiographies as well. Particularly think about, if you have the first few pages of Jawaharlal Nehru.
Nehru.
Yeah, his autobiography,
He
how
was extremely, how he was petrified when he lost a pen.
Yes. So, so and so the same with Gandhi and others. Gandhi himself, none of these fathers had good relationships with their children. Yeah, they had extremely vexed and conflicted relationship with their own biological children.
So I want to just make a comment about the grudge, and I was thinking, all right, in both Shuda and Hanabati Shen's memoirs, there's a kind of reaching to a kind of feminism, from the individual grudge. Like Shuda said that her mother, when her father said, "Oh, let the girl study," her mother said, "Yeah, and who's going to support her? Like, where is the land and the property that's going to go to that daughter?" And that, so she gives her mother a voice, which is a kind of what is the plight of girls? They don't inherit. They don't. So when you talk about letting her continue to study, you're not thinking about her future. And Hoimabati also often goes to the sort of social commentary. But I mean, she absolves her father, I think, in a way. Like, how could he? I mean, that no one wanted girls to study, then in fact, even in the system, there wasn't a way for her to take a certain exam because she wasn't a boy. And so I was thinking about the way in which they, and I don't know, I'm not thinking about the other autobiographies, but the reaching towards a larger social commentary to excuse the father as part of a process. But I also, I knew Moitri Devi, and she talked to me about her book. One thing, and in a way, in that conversation, she said that after her book was published, she got hundreds or thousands of letters I don't know if it's thousands or exaggeration or my memory is wrong, about women who said they were in the same plight. And she also, in that sense, in an individual, and this was a conversation about her own life, kind of excused her father as a part of a process. Although I agree with you. I mean, I think what you've done is pointing out the difference is really brilliant. So I just wanted to add like that. I don't know how often people reach to a larger explanation to excuse their fathers, or whether they do that with mothers as well.
Yeah, fathers played such an active role in terms of decision making, and daughters who chose to write, they tried to eliminate that part of establishing, succumbing to those patriarchal practices, in dealing with those kind of hardships, the plight that Maitreyi Devi raised. But in my life, I do not really have my father in my life, and my father, little of I had of him in my experience, was not the archetypes I have described here of being a very strict disciplinarian father. But if you talk to women of our generation, of the past generation, I don't know of the current generation, they have similar experiences like Leela Majumdar and Maitreyi Devi, and they had to navigate with the patriarchy, nurturing both the grudge and the fondness. So a lot of it is not written about. That's what I'm saying. And that's when, again, if we want to complicate the narratives further, that's when we have to resort to oral narratives, maybe interviewing women when they would talk to you more frankly than they would write in print.
I was wondering how fathers have been represented in fiction of this time, the Bengali fiction of this time. Have you found these abusive fathers? I mean, fathers, abusive, alcoholic fathers, fathers who beat their wives, or fathers who don't allow their daughters to study. I mean, how has fatherhood figured in fiction? I would like to hear your response on this.
Again, there's no one archetype, but there are many. They're complex and composite, and there are different kinds of elements. So, for example, again, I go back to the Tagore's. If you think about Rabindranath's portrayal of fathers, think about, let's if we bring in the lower social groups, think about Kabuliwala, right? Where an Afghan father comes for business, falls for this little girl. So that's all about fondness, affection. It's the love towards a child, and a child girl who is not connected to him by any kinship ties. So that's one. But again, we have, in Tagore's novel after novel, we see the reformed father, right? Be it in Gora, or or in Nokadubi, they are very open-minded fathers, who are fond of their daughters, and they were not giving their daughters to early marriage. So we see that. But again, the weak fathers, if we think about the weak, no, okay, let me stick to the poor fathers, and from this historical literatures. But again, a chapter that did not go into this book is poor fathers from Bibhuti-Bhushan Bandhopadhyay. If we take the father, Harihar, again full of fondness for his daughter, and the son, but there was a very strong differential behavior towards the boy and the girl. It's not the same. The boy, Opu was given, even if you remember that, Opu was given the food. Opu loved paesh, but there were, or even, the mother giving, saving food for Opu, but not for Durga. So that is also there, right? And that there's a lot more. I have written about it in terms of how Vibhuti Bhushan posed the boy child as an icon of masculinity, but and I discuss the many layers of masculinity there. But then you have that poor father who is also dedicated, who's not writing journals, who's not writing manuals, who's not writing autobiographies, but who is a living presence in late colonial Bengal, because most of these fathers, majority of the fathers were poor at that time. And we have, so many movies, so many novels, so many short stories depicting the role of fathers. But then, the one that sticks out to me in terms of women's narratives, and here again, I did not get to discuss it in this talk, is think about Ashapurna Devi's Pratham Pratishruti and Subharnalata, and you see the changes, you see how weak the father figure was. Right, Satyavati's husband.
Yes.
Satyavati was a strong woman. So, and I think you can give me 1,000 more examples because you are the literature person.
Yes.
There is,
Yes, I'm reminded of one short story by Onurupa Devi, Uro Chichi. And there's this father who refuses to send her daughter to school, but her daughter is she's brilliant and she excels in mathematics. But her father thinks that girls cannot do mathematics. They don't have brains. But then she is determined to do her studies and she passes out of school, and then her father decides to marry her off, and again there's a confrontation with her father with regard to this wedding and this matchmaking and all. So I was really thinking about this. Yes, Ashapurna Devi's Subharnalata and Pratham Pratishruti and Subharnalata have shown fathers in a different light, weak fathers. But Satyavati's father was not weak. I mean, he was someone to whom Satyavati could go after when she decided to leave her husband, leave her children. She decided to go to Kashi to stay with her father. So for her father was her refuge, her source of support and sustenance, but not so for Subharnalata. Subharnalata's father was a very weak person, of course. But there are other kinds of fathers in women's novels and short stories, and at times abusive fathers, fathers who beat their wives and even kill them. So I've got such fathers. I mean, come across such fathers in Shoilabala Ghosh Jaya's short stories, in Onurupa Devi's short stories. So there are also these examples of fathers who are not really supportive, do not really care for their daughters.
So Aparna, you hit the nail, because that's why I rely so much on literature which historians do not like, because I do not find this kind of evidence in the archives. They are not in the court records. There are court records on fathers on property right, but that does not constitute the ordinariness, the everydayness of lives, which I think is very important for historians to record and record. So that's why I go back to literature all the time. That's where you see, which allows us to have the more nuanced readings, because a lot of this autobiographical literature or normative texts, they do not, or scientific journals or official proceedings, they do not record this kind of intimate interactions and the complexity of the relationship of the nuanced personalities of an individual, be it a domestic worker or a father. Because again, I'm going back to my earlier work. My entire search for domestic workers, which is like you get 4 lines out of 400 pages, there is no mention of the sexual exploitation that goes on of domestic workers, or even the violence that was inflicted on them, on a very regular basis. And for that, I had to rely on literature, on fictional literature, right? And then the question is about the authenticity of those kind of sources. So that's a perennial problem of working on groups, on population who are on the margins for one way or the other.
Yes, I want to
No, there's-
say something.
oh.
Yeah. Can I?
I was going
Yes.
to say, there's Achut had put a comment, a question before. Could we just move to that? Achut, could you come on and perhaps,
Okay,
or,
let me see.
or shall I read it? Okay.
Okay, I see these.
His comment is, these are real women and memoirs of real women.
Mhm.
Oh, good. I'll let you ask your question. All right. Achut?
Mhm.
Oh, put
Please,
your sound on.
please unmute yourself, please.
Unmute. Okay.
No, basically the question is about the relationship between this kind of consciousness formation where you are, when you're already critiquing patriarchy within your homes, right, in your narratives, in your memoirs. So how does that translate into action, or is it influenced by what is happening in the wider world? Because we are seeing around the same time there's a major demand for daughters' property rights. So we see, as sociologists talk about very often in India, that despite all these legal changes, daughters still don't demand property in their paternal share, right? So what was the real scene like, or was there a kind of a traffic between these two spheres?
Well, Achut, first, I do not subscribe to the real in history because I really, am all for the constructed nature of written records, whether it's narratives or fiction. It's whether it's fiction or non-fiction. But I definitely see that what you are saying, a lot of the father-daughter dynamics and father-son dynamics too is connected to property rights. The whole debate, if we come to the 1955 when the Hindu Code Bill was written, it was about. You are exactly right. This was when the property rights of son versus daughter was being articulated in the Indian Constitution. And again, as a historian, I wanted to point out that what did the Hindu Code do in 1955? They actually, and thanks to the British, of course, they incorporated what they had laid out. They drew from Manu Samhita. That is the danger, and you know it better than I do probably in the history of Indian Constitution, that the Hindu marriage code and the Hindu code of rights for women were derived from Manu Samhita. So that Manu Samhita, whether it applies to real lives of men or women, we don't know, given the population, the cross-section of the Indian population, but they were codified. So the Hindu marriage code is based on that, right? And it is absolutely intrinsically connected to property rights. And actually, Bhashwati could say a lot more on that. Her work is on that, Newbegin, right? Elizabeth Newbegin has shown very, very clearly how women's rights, women's actions were tied to the property rights that they were given and their role in the making of the Constitution. Bhashwati is an expert in that field. So yes, absolutely so. So again, in trying to recuperate histories of people on the margins, as Shagota Lukke has also asked, we really have to look at the absences. And that is our source for historians, because we historians cannot rely principally on fictional sources as much as I want to, as much as they are index of reality. So there is that blurry line. Yes, there is a tremendous traffic, and I have not done that. And that's where I think, my work is going to be principally criticized or attacked on. That I have not, if I had gone to the property rights and the making of the property rights in colonial and post-colonial India, I would get a lot more evidence from the courts.
So I would imagine that your work will contribute to an understanding of the context within which property rights were fought for and maybe defeated.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I'm just opening up a Pandora's box for now. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just add one thing. It's not a question. My observation. When I dealt with autobiographies of some later women like Ashoka Gupta, Renuka Rai,
Right.
But in these autobiographies, there is a distinct mention of their contribution of their mothers instead of their fathers. So I think it's that the political scenario that has been changing from 20s onwards, and the consciousness and everything. Whom you have dealt, they are late 19th, early 20th.
Right.
And
Yeah.
whom I am talking about, they are late 20s and
Yeah.
30s, 40s.
Right.
So these women, when they are writing their autobiographies, reminiscing, they are uh, contributing their mothers for their
Yeah. Yeah, these are the women who came of age,
right.
So I'm talking about the making of these early women.
Right.
Then by the 1930s, as we saw, as Jerry's work has shown us so persuasively, that from 1910 onwards, we could even hold Sharula Devi Chaudhary as the iconic representative of that group. And from then onwards, since women's organizations came into being, your second social reform movement, that's when we have a formidable body, and Achut's own works also show that we have a formidable body of educated women who are reflecting on conditions of their mothers. Or so there has been history documents change over time, so we see that change, just like there is a change in the notion of fatherhood, in the notion and practices of fatherhood. We also see of course more drastic changes in the lives of, again, educated women, when they were also engaging in a lot of social work to bring lower social groups into the fold. Now, I see question from Shagota Lokhi. Yeah, yes, I have. There have been a lot of negotiations, and that's why this is actually one chapter, and again, this is part of a chapter when I talk about real biological fathers, but my fathers are mostly metaphorical. They are not real fathers of children, but I'm ascribing fatherhood to this emerging community of professionals who kind of assumed a fatherhood, a paternalistic attitude towards the community, to the new burgeoning group of young children. And I'm proposing that they were advocating an alternate form of pedagogy or education, which harped on filial piety, on respect towards elders, on respect towards their motherland, as opposed to the kind of child that the British school curriculum were proposing, which, because they had, the British had this book called the Indian Citizens, the Citizen Subject. Okay, so they had this. So yeah, and in that respect, personal affection. So fathers are not just, in the Indian scenarios, they are not just biological fathers, but the role of the biological fathers was also emphasized with the masculinization of property under colonial rule. So you cannot really cut this off from the process of social reproduction and the control of women's reproductive labor and British colonial policies on economics, particularly, right? I think, again, Bhashwati and others here are an expert on this, that they were bringing about so many legislations that pertained to male heirs, although Bengal was an exception because they followed the Daya Bhaga system, which gives equal rights to, on paper, on both male and female children. So it's complicated. It's absolutely complicated. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Shagota Lokhi here, and I prefer to unmute myself and ask another question. And I'm really sorry if I'm taking up space or time, but since we were discussing,
Okay, we want to hear you.
I just had a thought. And while we're talking about the relationship between biological fathers, metaphorical fathers, or, in the larger context and discourse of colonialism, I was thinking about the kind of relationship that women forged with their father-in-laws, because they also assumed a very significant position in their lives once they were married off. And in many cases, I mean, even in 20th century films and novels and other forms of representation, we see the father-in-law becoming the most important decision maker after a woman is married off, where her paternal father's or where her paternal family's decision really does not hold much. So, is there a way to incorporate these things into the history that you are trying to construct over here.
Absolutely so. Not in this case, not in this book. This book is done, and I don't propose to write another book on relationship between father-in-law and daughter and daughter-in-law. But it's a very, very pertinent point. You are absolutely right. And the classic case in point again that comes to mind is a relationship between Pratima Devi and Rabindranath Tagore. They were, it's the classic example, and all these, Devendranath and his daughters-in-law, because he assumed the guardianship of these 8-year-old, 10-year-olds, and then Rabindranath pretty much nurtured, and again, since I do not know the authenticity of this, there are Tagore scholars in the audience, they can talk more about it. There are these rumors of Rabindranath's, relationship with Pratima Devi that drove his son away, Rathindranath. So there are many aspects. Yes, the father figure, actually the biological father, the relationship with the biological father, I would say, transitioned to the relationship with the fathers-in-law, whose premise, whose house these daughters-in-law inhabited. You're absolutely right. That's a very, very pertinent point that I glossed over. I did not address that at all, except I did talk about Pratima Devi and Rabindranath. And Devendranath's attitude towards his daughters-in-law, but nothing more than that, not in the way you are alluding to. So thank you for this very important point, and something more to be explored.
One last thing. I was thinking about those women who are not sure who their biological fathers are, like Binodini Dashi. I don't exactly remember, but has Binodini Dashi written anything about her father or anybody else like her?
Aparna, I just took that part out of my talk because there are at least 3 exceptions that I flagged. For example, Rashundari Devi, who did not write about her father, who was writing for a different audience, right? As Tonika Sharkar has alerted us. But the 2 major exceptions from this milieu is they are Binodini Dashi, who leaves a scathing critique of the Bengali middle class patriarchy. She says explicitly she doesn't know who her father is, and Shunetra is here, she can probably attest to this. And the other one is Kanon Devi, and who openly says, Shobare Ami Nomi, her autobiography, which I love, it's such, she's also, a deeply devoted person, but she openly says that I don't know who my father is. So here, see, again, that is where the caste class component of our study becomes so important. We cannot make sweeping generalizations, and class, caste, gender, religious ideology, they intersect in our analysis. And that's why I kept on emphasizing, and that's why I kept it, to this fragment of sources that I examined. I did not go into length about Kanon Devi or Binodini Dashi, who did not openly said, but they also come from a very different background, right? Back in those days, in the 19th century. But not all women could. And then we move into the realm of fictions like Ashapurna Devi's, where we see, they are, Ashapurna Devi's, those trilogy, they are questioning patriarchy and the patriarchal practices. And then, we also have, Leela Majumdar's, if you look at this collection of short essays, many, not just one, like Nadi, Amiotai, you will see that that's where she's questioning patriarchy.
Yes. Thank you, Shapnati. And Jerry, do you want to say a few words in conclusion?
Yes. I think what hit me sitting here listening to these is the way this study opens us up. What I said is I will not, in the future, when I read, I'm not going to read in the same way because of the questions that you have raised. but then the way your questions and your work is sparking all of these other comments. What about literature? What about this? What about the intersection with reforms? What about father-in-laws? And I just remembered, I just was looking through my files of Shuna Majumdar material. I have a copy of a letter her father-in-law wrote to her. So I think I have to sort of dig this out. And then I start to remember, these other women who talked to me about their father-in-laws. So I appreciate that comment. The discussion has really been really wonderful. And I know that the audience here has actually of their own. There's a kind of richness of information that of the people who are listening and who are questioning and making comments. I just think this is really exciting for us, and we are really looking forward to the book coming out. Maybe at a later date. Maybe Women's Conclave can kind of, I don't know, maybe we can have a panel where other people can discuss some of these issues that Shawna raises. Again, I know that her book has, she's only drawing, or mostly she's drawing from one chapter here. And so, I mean, I'm really keen to read some of these others and how she looks at them. But I just want to thank you all for arranging this, Shawna for her talk, to Baswati and Aparna for their insightful questions, for arranging it, and to everyone who asked questions. So I'll just turn it over to you two to end this.
Yeah. So Bashwati, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Shawna Di and Bashwati. তুমি কিছু বলো at the end?
Yeah, we are grateful on behalf of Women's History Conclave. We thank both the speaker and the chairperson for spending we have spent such a wonderful time for more than 2 hours. It's such a blink of eye that we have, and such an insightful and engaging session. And so many questions, so many dimensions of the talk that has come out. So, and we all look forward to the book and hope we get a physical copy of the book very soon. So, thank you so much. Thank you, Joyshmita, for making the lovely poster once again. And thank you all the participants who have participated in this evening. And thanks to Aparna. Her infatigable energy, every time she is carrying forward the flag of the Women's History Conclave, because I'm a bit lethargic, but she is very, very energetic. And thank you all. Good night.
And this lecture has been recorded by my daughter Rushati, and it will be posted on. It will be uploaded on YouTube and also on our Facebook.
Right. Rushati is doing us silently. I just forgot to mention her name. Sorry, very sorry, Rushati. She's silently doing the work every time, and she's doing the recording, and she's uploading it in the Facebook and also YouTube also. So a great work is done by Rushati every time. So we thank Rushati also. Thank you so much, everyone.
But thank you. My last vote of thanks goes to this fabulous and as Bhashwati rightly put it, indefatigable energy that two of you exude and do for all of us and allow us to connect. I'm especially touched by these young members of our team, Nabonil and Rushati and Shagota, who it's for them that this book is written.
Of course.
Yeah. So if they appreciate it, that's the highest reward. And I don't have words to thank Jerry, of course. I know how busy her schedule is, and I don't know how she even managed these 3 hours in the morning, in a Saturday morning.